What does a woman do when the man who promised to protect her becomes the one thing she must survive? Rain struck the windows of Rothmere Hall like small stones flung by an angry hand. In the library, Duchess Margaret sat behind her husband's desk, a single candle burning low beside her, her fingers moving quickly through a ledger she had no right to open. She was 8 months into carrying his child, and for 8 months she had learned to listen for the sound of his boots before she ever heard his voice. Tonight the boots came uneven across the stone floor. She closed the ledger, but not quickly enough. The library door swung open, and Duke Julian Rothmere filled the frame, his cravat loosened, his eyes glassy with drink and something colder underneath it. He looked at the desk. He looked at her. He looked at the drawer she had not managed to shut. "Working late, Margaret?" he asked, and his voice carried the strange calm of a held breath, right before it broke. She did not answer. Silence bought her seconds, and on some nights, seconds were the only mercy she had left. He crossed the room slowly. Candlelight caught the ring on his hand, the same hand that, 6 nights before, had left a mark on her arm she still hid beneath her sleeve. She thought of the child inside her, and in that moment she made a decision that would end one of their lives before the year was through. Margaret had married Julian Rothmere on a bright April morning 11 months earlier, believing herself the most fortunate woman in Yorkshire. He was young for a duke, handsome in the way portraits are handsome, and when he had first bowed over her hand at her father's dinner table, he had smiled at her as though she were the only interesting thing in the room. She remembered every detail of the wedding morning itself with a clarity that sometimes startled her, given how far removed that young bride now felt from the woman she had become. The church at Rothmere village had been decorated with hothouse roses out of season, an extravagance Julian had insisted upon simply to see her smile, and she had walked up the aisle on her father's arm believing, with the whole of her young heart, that she was walking toward a life larger and safer than any she could have built on her own. Julian had waited for her at the altar in a coat the exact deep blue of a winter evening sky, and when their eyes met across the short remaining distance, he had smiled at her in a way that made the entire church, the roses, the murmuring guests, seem to fall away into a soft and distant blur. She had thought, watching him watch her, that she had never in her life been looked at with such open, undisguised want. She understood now, looking back, that want and love were not always the same thing, and that a man could want a woman's fortune every bit as fiercely as he wanted her hand. Her father, a wool merchant who had spent 30 years buying his way toward respectability, wept openly with pride when the betrothal was announced. Neighbors who had once looked past the merchant's daughter at county assemblies suddenly remembered her name and her manners. Margaret had believed, foolishly and completely, that she was walking into a fairy tale, the kind she had read as a girl, where a good heart was rewarded with a title and a grand house and a husband who adored her. The fairy tale lasted 4 months. It ended on an ordinary Tuesday, when Julian returned from business in Leeds smelling of gin and something sharper underneath it, and asked her, in a voice gone thin and strange, why she had spoken to the steward without his permission. She had only asked the man whether the kitchen roof had been mended after the summer storms. It seemed a small thing, the sort of question any mistress of a house might ask. Julian's hand found her wrist before she finished explaining herself. He gripped hard enough to bruise, then let go just as suddenly, and apologized so sincerely, with such genuine confusion at his own behavior, that Margaret spent that first night convinced the fault must somehow be her own. It was the first time. It was not the last. The second time came only a fortnight afterward, and it required no question at all to provoke it, only a small silence that Julian had apparently found more offensive than any words might have been. He had come to her sitting room after a long evening at his club, and had begun, without preamble, to describe a business acquaintance he despised, growing more agitated with every sentence, and Margaret, exhausted and unsure what response he wanted from her, had simply listened without offering the enthusiastic agreement he seemed to expect. He had crossed the room in 3 strides and gripped her by both shoulders, shaking her once, hard, demanding to know whether she found him tiresome, whether her silence meant she thought herself too clever or too fine to trouble herself with his troubles. She had assured him, with a speed and warmth she did not truly feel, that she found nothing about him tiresome at all, and he had released her at once, contrite and almost tender, kissing her forehead and calling her his good, patient girl. She had lain awake long afterward, turning the strange whiplash of that evening over in her mind, and had begun, without quite naming the habit to herself, to rehearse enthusiastic responses in advance, the way an actress rehearses lines, so that she would never again be caught in a silence he might mistake for judgment. By winter, Margaret had learned the geography of Rothmere Hall the way a prisoner learns a cell. She knew which floorboards creaked and which stayed silent beneath a careful step. She knew that the library was safest before 9 and most dangerous after 11, once the brandy had done its slow work on him. She knew to keep her sleeves long regardless of the season, and her voice low, and her opinions folded away where they could not be mistaken for defiance, because in that house, an opinion was a kind of provocation, and provocation always had a cost. The servants knew as well, though none of them spoke of it plainly. Mrs. Pratchett, the housekeeper, had worked at Rothmere Hall for 2 decades under the old Duke, Julian's father, and she moved through the corridors each morning with a basket of clean linens and a particular gentleness in how she addressed the young Duchess, a gentleness that asked no questions and offered no judgment, only small kindnesses. A fire built up an hour earlier than usual, a tray left outside a locked door without comment. Margaret understood these gestures for what they were. She was grateful for them in a way that had no polite name. Margaret was pregnant by spring, and she told herself, in the particular way frightened people convince themselves of things, that the child would change him. That a man who had once wanted so badly to be loved would surely soften at the prospect of being a father. Fear does strange arithmetic. It convinces a woman that hope is a plan, when in truth it is only a way of surviving until the next difficult hour arrives. She remembered telling him the news on a bright morning in March, in the small breakfast room where they still, on their better days, managed something resembling the easy companionship of their first weeks together. He had gone very still at her words, and then had crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, taking both her hands in his, and for a long moment Margaret had seen, or believed she saw, the young man from her wedding morning looking back at her again, unguarded and genuinely moved. He had spoken that day of an air with real warmth in his voice, of a future for Rothmere Hall he could finally look forward to rather than merely endure, and Margaret had allowed herself, for the length of that one golden morning, to believe that the child growing within her might yet undo whatever dark thing had taken hold of her husband since their wedding day. The warmth lasted the better part of a fortnight. She learned, before April was out, that a man's tenderness toward an unborn child and his tenderness toward the woman carrying it were not, after all, the same promise, and that one could exist quite comfortably beside the other's complete absence. It was Dr. Nathaniel Hale who first saw the truth plainly, though he never said the word aloud. He had been summoned to Rothmere Hall on a night in early autumn, when Margaret had fallen or been pushed, though the servants were careful never to use that word within the hearing of the family down the last 3 steps of the east staircase. He arrived within the hour, his bag in hand, his coat still damp from the ride, and his eyes did not flinch from what they found. He examined her wrist, gently turning it in the lamplight. He examined the small cut above her eyebrow, and the bruising along her ribs that she tried, without success, to explain away as the result of the fall alone. A staircase does not leave marks shaped like fingers, he said quietly, so quietly that only Margaret heard it, his gaze fixed on her wrist rather than her face, as though he understood that meeting her eyes just then would only frighten her further. "It was dark," Margaret said. "I do not remember clearly." "No," he agreed, in the same gentle voice. "I imagine you do not." He did not press further. He instead gathered the small vials and bandages from his bag with the unhurried care of a man who had learned, over many years of practice, that patience often did more good than direct questioning ever could. He gave his instructions to Mrs. Pratchett regarding rest and a cold compress, speaking clearly enough that both women in the room might hear and remember them, and only then turned back to Margaret before he left. "May I ask you something plainly, Duchess, and trust that you will not think less of me for asking," he said, and waited for her small nod before continuing. "Is there anyone in this house, or beyond it, in whom you feel you may confide, should you ever need it? A sister, perhaps, or a trusted friend from before your marriage?" Margaret considered the question longer than she meant to, surprised by how difficult it was to answer. "There was a friend, once, from school," she said finally. "Lady Cecilia Ashford. We have not corresponded in some time." "Then perhaps," Dr. Hale said carefully, "it might do you good to write to her again. Old friendships have a way of proving sturdier than we remember them to be, particularly in difficult seasons." Margaret understood only much later, the smallest possible nudge, offered so gently that she did not recognize it as guidance at the time, only as ordinary kindness. She thought of his words again 3 weeks later, on a quiet evening when loneliness pressed him more heavily than usual, and she took up her pen at last and wrote to Cecilia for the first time in over a year. "You will send for me again," he said, "if the pain in your side does not ease by morning. Or," the doctor added, after the smallest pause, "for any other reason at all. I do not require an excuse to be summoned, Duchess. Only a note." "It will ease," Margaret said, because that was what one said. He looked at her a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed, and something passed between them that was not romance yet, only recognition of the particular relief of being seen by someone who did not pretend not to see. She had grown so used to being unseen, Margaret thought, long after he had gone, The house settled once more into its watchful quiet. The being looked at honestly felt almost like being touched. Julian did not apologize the next morning, or any morning after. He sent flowers instead, cut from a hothouse and arranged by the very hands that had left the bruise. And Margaret arranged them in a vase by the window and told herself, once again, that things would be different once the child came. She wrote a letter to her father that week describing her happiness in broad, cheerful strokes, and she posted it herself, and she did not read it again afterward, because she suspected that if she did, she would recognize every sentence as a lie she had chosen to tell. There were nights that autumn when Margaret sat alone in her small sitting room, listening to the wind move through the bare orchard beyond her window, and tried to remember the precise moment the fear had settled into her so completely that she no longer noticed its weight, the way a person stops noticing the weight of a shawl worn every day for months. She could not find that moment. It seemed instead to have arrived gradually, one small silence at a time, one swallowed question at a time, until an entire year of her life had been quietly rearranged around the simple, constant work of not upsetting him. She wrote to her father twice that autumn and told him nothing true. She told her old governess, in a longer letter she never posted, everything, and then burned the pages in the small grate before Julian returned from his club, watching the paper curl black and then grey and then nothing at all, and thinking that this was very much like her own situation. Something real, reduced by careful hands to something that could be swept away and never spoken of again. She did not yet know that Julian's temper was not simply drink, or grief, or the ordinary cruelty of a spoiled man grown used to having his way. She did not yet know that somewhere in his study, locked in a drawer she had never been permitted to open, lay documents bearing her own forged signature, and debts large enough to swallow her father's entire fortune twice over. She knew only the nightly sound of his boots on the stone floor, and the nightly work of making herself small enough, quiet enough, careful enough, to survive until morning. There had been a particular evening in September, before the staircase, before Dr. Hale, when Margaret had still believed she might reason her way back to the man she had married. She had waited for Julian in the drawing-room with a supper laid out and warmed twice over, and when he finally arrived past 10, unsteady and short-tempered, she had asked him gently, carefully, whether something troubled him that he might wish to share with his wife. He had laughed at that, a short, humorless sound, and told her that a wife's place was to ask no questions at all, and that her father's money had bought her a title, not the right to trouble herself with matters that were not hers to understand. She had gone to bed that night turning his words over and over, searching for the version of them that might be kindly meant, the way a person searches a dark room for a door they know must be there somewhere. She did not find it. She lay awake instead composing, in her own mind, all the sensible replies she had not dared to give aloud, and she understood, somewhere in the small hours before dawn, that a marriage built on silence was not truly a marriage at all, only a kind of careful, mutual pretending. By November, even the servants had stopped pretending quite so hard. Old Simmons, the butler, had taken to lingering near the hall each evening until he heard Julian's carriage safely away again for the night, a habit Margaret suspected was less about his duties than about making certain she was not left entirely alone in the house with a man whose moods had grown so unpredictable. She never thanked him for it directly, for that would have required naming a thing neither of them was permitted to name, but she began leaving a cup of tea for him in the small pantry each night before retiring, and he began, in turn, always finding some small reason to be nearby a little longer than strictly necessary. The opportunity came in October. When Julian rode to York for 3 days on business he did not explain and did not invite her to ask about. In the days leading up to that journey, Margaret had begun, almost without deciding to, acquire a sort of preparation of her own. She had started keeping a private calendar, marked in a code only she could read, noting the dates and rough nature of each difficult evening not out of any clear plan yet, only from a growing instinct that a pattern written down might someday mean something a pattern merely remembered could not. She kept the calendar folded inside the lining of an old bonnet she no longer wore, in a hatbox pushed to the back of her wardrobe, and she added to it in the private minutes after Julian had finally fallen into a heavy, brandy-soaked sleep each night, her candle shielded carefully behind a folded screen so that no light might show beneath the door. Margaret waited until the house had settled into its evening quiet, the servants retired, the corridors dark but for a single lamp left burning at her own request, and then she took the ring of household keys from the housekeeper's drawer, a small theft Mrs. Pratchett would later swear, if ever asked, that she had never noticed, and let herself into her husband's study. She told herself she was only looking for her marriage settlement, the document that named what was hers by right and what belonged to the estate. Her father had been careful about such things, more careful than Margaret had appreciated at the time. He had insisted, against the old Duke's mild objection, on a settlement that protected her dowry even after marriage, a small fortune held separately in her name, meant to remain hers regardless of what became of the union. She wanted, simply, to see it with her own eyes, to hold proof that at least one part of her life had not been entirely surrendered on her wedding day. What she found instead was a second ledger, hidden beneath a false bottom in the lowest drawer, its pages full of numbers that made no sense to her at first, and then made a terrible sort of sense once she read them a second time. Loans taken against her dowry, drawn month after month since the earliest weeks of their marriage. A signature, or something meant to pass for it on documents she had never seen and certainly never signed, granting Julian authority over funds that were meant, by law and by her father's careful arrangement, to remain entirely beyond his reach. She sat on the floor of the study with the ledger open across her knees, her candle guttering low, and traced the false signature with one finger, comparing it, in her memory, against her own hand. The forger had been careful, but not careful enough. The letter M curled the wrong way at its final stroke, a small habit that belonged to Julian's own handwriting, not to hers. She had noticed it 100 times on notes he had left her in their first happy months, never imagining she would one day recognize it as evidence of a crime against her own name. She turned page after page of the false ledger by the light of her single candle, and the more she read, the more clearly a pattern emerged, one she had been too frightened, until that night, to allow herself to see in full. The debts had not begun with some sudden misfortune, a bad investment or an unlucky season at cards, as she had once assumed. They stretched back further than that, back before their wedding day itself, back to a set of obligations Julian's own father had left unpaid at his death, obligations Julian had inherited along with his title and had spent every month quietly, desperately trying to outrun. Margaret understood, reading those figures, that she had not married a cruel man by nature so much as a frightened one, a man who had discovered, upon inheriting his father's debts along with his father's house, that cruelty was simply the fastest tool available to a desperate hand. It did not excuse him. It did not soften a single bruise she had carried these past 11 months. But it clarified something for her all the same. The way a single true fact can sometimes make an entire confusing year suddenly make terrible, coherent sense. Beneath the ledger lay a letter, addressed to a Sir Edmund Voss, the family's longtime solicitor, a stooped, precise man Margaret had always regarded as stern but scrupulously honest, a man who had witnessed her own marriage settlement and shaken her hand afterward with what she had believed, at the time, to be genuine warmth. The letter thanked Voss for his discretion in notarizing certain papers, and mentioned, almost in passing, an arrangement to have Margaret examined by a physician of Voss's own choosing after the child's birth, a physician who would testify, should it ever be required, to her nervous constitution and her unfitness for the management of her own affairs. Margaret sat very still for a long time after she read that. They mean to call me mad, she thought, the candle flame trembling with her own unsteady breath, so that a madwoman's fortune becomes a sane man's inheritance, and no court in England would think to question a husband's tender concern for his wife's failing nerves. She copied what she could into a small notebook of her own, tucked always afterward inside the lining of her sewing basket, her hand shaking so badly that some of the figures came out crooked, and then she returned every document exactly as she had found it, the false bottom fitted back into place, the drawer locked, the keys returned to Mrs. Pratchett's own drawer before dawn. Before she left the study that night, she allowed herself a few minutes longer than was strictly wise, sitting very still in Julian's own chair, looking about the room as though seeing it for the first time. It struck her, in that quiet hour, how completely the room reflected the man who occupied it. The fine leather bindings on the shelves, purchased more for their appearance than ever read, the portrait of the old Duke glowering down from above the mantel, and beneath it all, hidden in drawers and false bottoms, the true and shabby architecture of a man's fear dressed up as authority. She thought of her own father's modest study in Leeds, cluttered with real ledgers openly kept, nothing hidden because nothing needed hiding, and she understood, with a clarity that steadied her more than it frightened her, that she had been raised by an honest man to expect honesty as the ordinary condition of a household, and that Rothmere Hall had taught her, slowly and cruelly, that it was not. She did not sleep that night. She lay beside the cold half of the bed Julian had not yet returned to fill, one hand resting on the curve of her stomach, feeling the small, insistent movements of the child within, and she made herself a private promise, spoken almost silently into the dark. Whatever else happened, her child would not be born into a house built on forgery and fear. When Julian returned from York 2 days later, he was gentler than he had been in months, almost courtly, bringing her a length of blue silk he claimed to have chosen specially with her eyes in mind. And for one dangerous evening Margaret allowed herself to wonder whether she had misjudged him entirely, whether the ledger belonged to some old business of his father's, whether she had frightened herself over nothing. Then, over dinner, she noticed a fresh ink stain on his right cuff, the same faint blue-black stain that always appeared after long hours bent over his study desk, and she understood, with a coldness that settled deep and quiet within her, that gentleness, in this house, was simply another tool, brought out and set aside as circumstances required, used most often when cruelty had grown too obvious to remain safe. She smiled at him across the table and asked after his journey and said nothing at all of what she knew. She had learned, by then, that survival sometimes looked exactly like surrender, and that the two were not always as different as she had once believed. Late that same week, she found a further excuse to speak with Mrs. Pratchett alone, under the pretense of discussing linens for the nursery. The older woman listened to Margaret's careful, roundabout questions about the household's finances with an expression that gave away nothing at first, and then, once she had satisfied herself that the door was truly closed, she spoke in a low voice of her own. "There have been men here at odd hours these past months, your ladyship, come to see his grace in the study after the rest of the house has gone to bed. I have never been told their business, and I have never asked for it. But I have seen Sir Edmund's carriage in the drive past midnight more than once, and I did not think that was worth mentioning to anyone, until now." Margaret thanked her, and pressed no further, understanding that Mrs. Pratchett had given her exactly as much as her long years of careful service allowed her to give, and that it was, in its own quiet way, a great deal. Everyone in this house has been keeping a version of the same secret, Margaret thought that night, each of us certain we alone carried the whole weight of it. She spent the following days moving carefully between two selves. In the mornings, she was the dutiful young duchess, overseeing menus and linens and the small ordinary business of a great house, smiling at neighbors who called to admire her condition and remark on how well marriage seemed to suit her. In the evenings, alone in her sitting room with the door bolted and a single candle burning, she was someone else entirely, a woman assembling, one careful page at a time, the case that might one day save both her own life and her child's inheritance. She found, to her own quiet surprise, that she was rather good at the second kind of work. Her father had always said she had a head for figures sharper than most men gave a daughter credit for, and in the long autumn evenings, poring over copied ledgers by candlelight, she finally understood what he had meant by it. Once, in early November, Julian came upon her bent over her notebook so intently that she did not hear his step until he was nearly beside her chair. She closed the cover with a calm she did not feel and told him she was composing a letter to her sister-in-law, a small, unremarkable lie that he accepted without much interest, being at that hour more occupied with his own troubles than with hers. She sat afterward with her heart pounding long after he had gone, and understood, with a clarity that frightened her, exactly how thin the margin had become between safety and disaster. Lady Cecilia Ashford arrived at Rothmere Hall on the first Sunday of November, ostensibly to see how her old school friend was managing so near her confinement. She wore crimson that day, a deep, deliberate red against the grey Yorkshire afternoon, a colour Margaret would later understand as a kind of signal, chosen precisely because it could not be overlooked or easily forgotten. They took tea in the small parlour at the rear of the house, away from the servants who reported everything, in the end, to the housekeeper, who reported everything, in the end, to Julian. Cecilia waited until the door was fully closed and the footsteps in the corridor had faded before she spoke plainly, setting down her cup with a decisiveness that told Margaret this visit had been planned days in advance. "I have heard things, Margaret," she said, "about Edmund Voss, and about a physician in Harrogate he has already engaged on retainer. I did not wish to frighten you needlessly, but I would rather frighten you now than let you be taken entirely by surprise." "Surprised by what?" Margaret asked, though some part of her, some part that had been reading ledgers by candlelight for 3 weeks, already suspected the answer. "They intend to have you declared unfit once the child is born. Nerves, they will call it. A melancholy of the mind, brought on, no doubt, by the strain of childbirth, and requiring a period of quiet rest away from the burdens of household management." Cecilia's hands remained steady around her teacup, but her eyes did not. "It happens more often than good society cares to admit, Margaret, and it is remarkably easy to arrange when a husband and his solicitor agree on the diagnosis beforehand, and the physician who signs it owes his position to the man who pays him. Once you are declared unfit, the law gives Julian everything. Your dowry, your child. Even the letters you write would pass first through his hands before ever reaching their intended reader." Margaret set down her own cup before it could betray her by shaking against the saucer. "How do you know all this?" "Because my late husband's cousin is married to Voss's senior clerk, and because I have spent 3 months listening very carefully at dinners I was not truly invited to enjoy, only tolerated at, as a widow of useful family connections." Cecilia leaned forward, lowering her voice further still. "I am not simply here for tea, Margaret. I have been trying to find a way to help you since your wedding day, when I watched Julian look at you the way a man looks at property he has already priced for eventual resale." "You suspected, even then?" "I have known men like him my whole life," Cecilia said, and something old and unhealed moved behind her eyes. I recognized the look. I only wished, very much, that I was wrong." She was quiet for a moment, turning her teacup slowly on its saucer, before she continued, her voice lower now, more careful. "My own late husband was not a violent man, Margaret, whatever else his faults. But I watched my mother endure 20 years of a marriage very much like the one you are living now, and I spent my own girlhood learning exactly which of my father's moods meant supper should be eaten quickly and quietly, and which meant it was safer not to come to the table at all. I did not understand, until I was much older, that what I had learned to call his temper had a plainer name, and that my mother's endless small accommodations were not simply the ordinary business of marriage, as I had always been taught to believe, but a woman's daily labor of survival, disguised as devotion. I have spent a good many years since telling myself I would never again watch that particular story unfold in silence, without at least trying to change its ending." Margaret reached across the table then, before Cecilia had even finished speaking, and pressed her friend's hand between both of her own. "I am sorry," she said simply, "for your mother, and for the girl who had to learn such things so young." "Do not be sorry," Cecilia said, recovering herself with visible effort, straightening in her chair. "Be careful instead, and be ready, and let me help you become the ending my mother never had." Margaret felt something loosen inside her that had been wound tight for 11 months. Not relief exactly, not yet, but the particular strength that comes from learning, finally, that one is not alone in a fight one had believed entirely private. "What do you propose?" she asked. "That we gather proof of the forgery while you can still move freely enough to visit your father's solicitor in Leeds without arousing suspicion, and copy it, and lodge those copies somewhere Julian cannot reach them, and that we arrange somewhere safe for you to go, the very moment it becomes necessary to go there." Cecilia's voice dropped lower still, barely above a whisper. "I have already written to my brother, the Colonel. He keeps a house near the coast that no one in this county would think to search for, and he owes me a debt of his own from our childhood that he has been waiting years for the chance to repay." A door had opened, Margaret thought, in a house she had believed, until this very afternoon, to be entirely without doors. "Why would you risk yourself for me, Cecilia?" she asked quietly. "We were friends at school. We have hardly spoken in the years since." Cecilia's careful, guarded expression cracked, just slightly, at the corners. "Because 6 years ago, a different friend asked me for help of exactly this kind, and I was too frightened of scandal, too concerned with my own small reputation, to give it plainly. She did not live to see her own child's first birthday, Margaret. I have had 6 years now to sit with that silence, and I find I have grown tired of carrying it." "Do not be sorry," Cecilia said, recovering herself with visible effort, straightening in her chair. "Be careful instead, and be ready, and let me help you become the ending my mother never had." They spoke for a while longer about smaller, practical matters, which of the household staff could be trusted, which roads out of the county saw the least traffic after dark, how a woman 8 months with child might travel any distance at all without drawing notice. Cecilia had thought of details Margaret herself had not yet considered, down to the particular inn near the county line where a tired traveller might rest a single night without her name ever appearing in a guest register, its landlady owing Cecilia's family a debt of gratitude from years past that had never yet been called in. Margaret found herself, for the first time in many months, laughing quietly at some small remark of Cecilia's about the landlady's terrible taste in wallpaper, and the sound of her own laughter, unfamiliar and a little rusty, surprised her nearly as much as anything else that whole extraordinary afternoon. "There is one more matter," Cecilia added, before rising to take her leave that afternoon, drawing on her gloves with careful, deliberate movements. "Dr. Hale. I believe he suspects a great deal more than he has ever said aloud in this house, and I believe, from the manner in which he speaks of you, that his concern reaches somewhat further than professional duty alone requires. I do not say this to embarrass you, Margaret, only so that you know you have more allies within these walls than you may have realized." Margaret felt her color rise, and found she had no ready answer for that. "This is hardly the moment to speak of such things." "No," Cecilia agreed, with the faintest suggestion of a smile, the first Margaret had seen from her that whole difficult afternoon. "But it may yet become the moment, once this present danger has passed. I only wished you to know it was there, waiting, whenever you are ready to see it plainly." Margaret reached across the small table and took her friend's hand, and for the first time since April, since that bright, hopeful wedding morning that now felt as though it belonged to a different woman entirely, she allowed herself to believe that the story of her life might yet end somewhere other than where it had so far led. Winter closed in over Yorkshire, grey and early and cold, and with it came the slow, careful work of preparation. Margaret learned, in bits and pieces gathered across several of his visits that autumn, something of Dr. Hale's own history, offered always briefly and without self-pity, as though he considered his own past a matter of little consequence beside the work of his present patients. He had trained in Edinburgh, the younger son of a country person with no fortune to leave him, and had chosen medicine, he told her once, precisely because it was a profession that asked what a person could do rather than what family they had been born into. He had lost a young wife to a fever some 6 years past, in his very first year of practice, and Margaret suspected, though he never said it outright, that the helplessness of that early loss had shaped the particular gentleness with which he now approached every patient's pain, as a thing to be taken seriously rather than managed briskly and dismissed. He had never remarried, and when Mrs. Pratchett once remarked, within Margaret's hearing, that it seemed a pity for so kind a man to keep so solitary a household, Margaret had found herself, to her own private surprise, thinking about that observation for a good deal longer than the remark itself seemed to warrant. Margaret visited her father's solicitor in Leeds twice that December, under the entirely reasonable pretense of arranging matters for the coming child, and each time she carried away copies of documents that would matter a very great deal in a courtroom, should it ever come to that. Cecilia carried messages between Rothmere Hall and the Colonel's house near the coast, folded small inside gloves and hidden in the lining of hat-boxes, and slowly, patiently, a plan took shape between the two women. Margaret would leave on the night of the Rothmere Christmas ball, when the house would be full of guests and half empty of watchful attention, and a carriage, arranged through the Colonel's own household, would be waiting quietly at the old orchard gate an hour before midnight. There was a particular afternoon that December, one Margaret returned to often in her memory in later years, when Dr. Hale had lingered somewhat longer than his examination strictly required, ostensibly reviewing his written notes a second time at the small writing desk in the corner of her sitting room, while Mrs. Pratchett attended briefly to some matter in the corridor. He had looked up at her once, unguarded, and asked, in a voice pitched too low for anyone beyond the room to hear, whether she had given any thought to what her life might look like, one day, once the present danger had passed and Julian was no longer any part of it. Margaret had not expected the question, and had answered honestly, before caution could catch up with her tongue. I have thought of very little else. Some nights. A small house, perhaps. A garden. My daughter grew up somewhere quiet, never once learning to listen for a man's boots in the corridor. And beyond that? He had asked, so gently that it took her a moment to understand he was asking something more particular than her plans for a garden. She had felt her colour rise, and had not trusted herself to answer plainly, not yet, with so much danger still standing squarely between the present moment and any future either of them might privately imagine. Beyond that, I have not yet allowed myself to think, Doctor. It did not feel safe, until now, to want anything beyond survival. Then perhaps, he had said, gathering his notes and rising as Mrs. Pratchett's returning footsteps sounded in the corridor, it is time you began allowing yourself a little more than that. Dr. Hale became, without either of them quite naming it aloud, a part of the plan as well. He called on Margaret twice weekly under the reasonable and unremarkable excuse of monitoring her condition so near her time, and in those visits, conducted always with Mrs. Pratchett present in the room as propriety demanded, he found small, careful ways to be useful. He confirmed, from his own professional observation and his own written notes, the pattern and approximate dates of her injuries across the past 11 months, should sworn testimony ever be required by a court. He mentioned, once, almost in passing, that he had a trusted colleague in a coastal town who would be glad of a skilled midwife's assistance, should Margaret ever find herself travelling in that particular direction near her confinement. You are very careful with your words, Doctor, Margaret said to him one grey afternoon, when Mrs. Pratchett had briefly left the room to fetch fresh linens. I have learned to be, he said, folding his stethoscope back into his bag with unhurried hands. A man in my position sees a great deal he is not always permitted to say plainly, not without endangering the very patients he means to protect. I have found that saying a difficult thing carefully serves a person far better than saying nothing at all, and leaving her to wonder whether anyone has noticed her suffering. She studied him for a moment, the steadiness of his hands, folded now in his lap rather than moving over his instruments, the way his grey eyes held hers without demanding anything of her in return, without the watchful calculation she had grown so accustomed to reading in every other man's face. He asks nothing of me, she thought, and somehow that has become the rarest kindness I have known in the whole of this past year. There had been another visit, some weeks earlier, that Margaret found herself returning to often in quiet moments. Dr. Hale had come at an hour when Julian was away in Harrogate, and Mrs. Pratchett had been called briefly from the room to attend a small matter downstairs, leaving the two of them alone for perhaps 5 minutes in total, no more. Margaret had asked him, in a rush of courage she did not fully understand even as she spoke, whether he thought her foolish for having believed, once, that things might improve. I think, he had said, choosing his words with the same careful precision he brought to his medicine, that hope is not foolishness, Duchess. It is only dangerous when it is asked to do the work that action alone can properly do. You are not foolish for having hoped. You would only be unwise to go on hoping forever, in place of doing something further. He had paused then, and added, more quietly, I do not believe you intend to make that particular mistake much longer. I have watched you these past weeks. You are already doing something further, whatever it is, and doing it very carefully indeed. She had not confirmed or denied it, and he had not pressed her to, but she had carried his words with her afterward like a small, steady lamp, lighting the careful work still ahead of her. Thank you, she said simply, for not looking away, all these months, when it would have been so very much easier for you to do so. I could not, even if I wished for it, he answered, and then, as though he had said more than he intended to allow himself, he rose and gathered his bag and spoke instead, in a brisker voice, of tea that might ease the swelling in her ankles. But Julian was not blind, whatever else he had become. He noticed the increased frequency of his wife's errands to Leeds, each one accompanied by a longer absence than the last. He noticed Cecilia's visits growing more frequent and lasting longer, behind doors that were closed a little too firmly for ordinary tea and gossip. And he noticed, with a particular suspicion of a guilty man watching for the first signs of discovery, that his wife had begun to meet his eyes across the dinner table without flinching, as though she had found some private source of courage he had neither authorized nor understood. He said nothing of it directly, not at first. Instead, he doubled the locks on his study door, and he began, that December, to drink earlier in the evening than he ever had before, as though something in him sensed the careful walls of his arrangement beginning, very slowly, to shift beneath his feet. There was one evening in mid-December that came very close to ending the plan entirely, before it had ever properly begun. Margaret had gone to her writing desk to record the week's small figures in the notebook hidden within her sewing basket, and had not heard Julian step in the corridor over the sound of the fire, and he entered her sitting room just as she was closing the basket's lid. "What are you writing, so intently, that you did not hear me come in?" he asked, and though his tone was light, almost teasing, Margaret felt the old, familiar coldness move through her all the same. "Household accounts," she said, and made herself hold his gaze rather than dropping it, because she had learned, slowly and at considerable cost, that dropping her eyes too quickly was itself a kind of confession. "The kitchen expenses have run high this month, and I did not wish to trouble you with the details when you have so much else on your mind." He studied her for a long moment, and Margaret felt the whole careful architecture of the past 3 months balanced on the outcome of that single look. Then he smiled, the old easy smile from their first months together, and told her she worried too much over trifles, and left her alone with her basket and her racing heart and a fear so complete that her hands did not stop shaking for the better part of an hour. She told Cecilia of it the following day, and Cecilia, very quietly, moved their timeline forward by a full week. 3 days before the Christmas ball, Julian came home at 4 in the afternoon, far earlier than his habit, and far drunker than the hour ought to have allowed. He found Margaret in her sitting room, a small trunk half-packed beneath a shawl she had left conspicuously unfinished, its needle still threaded through the last few stitches, and something in his expression told her, before he said a single word, that the fairy tale, even its bitter, broken remnant, had finally, entirely, ended. "Going somewhere, my dear?" Julian asked, and he did not slur the words, though the smell of brandy filled the small room like smoke rolling in from an open door. Margaret did not reach for the trunk, or the shawl, or any explanation that might sound like a lie he could easily catch her in. "I am preparing for the child, Julian, as any mother nearing her time would." "You are preparing to leave me." He crossed the room in 3 long strides and threw back the shawl, revealing the trunk's true contents, the copied documents, the letters from Cecilia, the small collection of coins Margaret had saved from her household allowance, 1 careful shilling at a time across many quiet months. His face moved through several colors before settling on something Margaret had never once seen there in 11 months of marriage. Not simple rage, but fear, thin and desperate underneath the anger, the fear of a man watching his own carefully built house of cards begin to fall. "You went into my study," he said. "I went looking for my own marriage settlement," Margaret answered, and she was surprised, even in that moment, to hear how steady her own voice remained. "I found instead that my signature has been forged on documents I never signed, and that Sir Edmund Voss has arranged for a physician of his own choosing to declare me unfit the very moment this child is born. Tell me I am wrong, Julian. Tell me plainly, and I promise I will believe you, because God knows I have wanted so very badly to believe you for 11 long months." He did not tell her she was wrong. He said nothing at all for a long moment, and his silence answered her more completely than any confession could have. Instead, he rang for Sir Edmund Voss, who arrived within the hour as though he had been waiting somewhere nearby for exactly such a summons, his black coat buttoned to the throat, his narrow face already arranged into the stern, patient expression of a man long accustomed to managing other people's disasters at a comfortable distance. He looked at the open trunk, and at Margaret standing pale but unmoving beside it, and at Julian shaking hands, and he sighed, briefly, as though the whole unfortunate affair was simply tiresome, a matter of scheduling rather than of conscience. "This need not become unpleasant, Your Grace," Voss said, addressing Margaret with a particular condescension reserved for a woman he had already decided did not fully understand her own circumstances. "His Grace has considerable debts, incurred in defense of this family's standing in the county, debts that required prompt and discreet resolution. The arrangements made were entirely lawful, and entirely necessary. A woman so near her confinement would do well to consider her own health, rather than concerning herself with matters far better left to men who understand them." "The arrangements were forged, Sir Edmund," Margaret said, and she made herself look directly into his narrow, unblinking eyes as she said it. "I have copies enough to prove it, lodged already with my father's own solicitor in Leeds, with clear written instructions to be opened before a magistrate should any harm come to me, or to this child, before the year is out." Something flickered across Voss's face at the first true uncertainty Margaret had ever seen across his carefully composed features in 11 months of dealing with him. She had learned, in the week since discovering the ledger, a little of Sir Edmund Voss's own history, pieced together from Cecilia's careful inquiries and a stray remark or two from Mrs. Pratchett. He had served the Rothmere family for nearly 30 years, first under Julian's father and then under Julian himself, and had built, in that time, a comfortable practice founded almost entirely on the family's continued patronage. A conviction for forgery against a duke's own wife would not merely end his career, it would very likely end every other client relationship he had spent 3 decades cultivating. Men who value discretion above nearly everything else and would want nothing further to do with a solicitor who had proven himself so carelessly exposed. Margaret understood, watching the calculation move behind his narrow eyes, that Voss was no longer weighing his loyalty to Julian at all. He was weighing, in that single suspended moment, exactly how much of his own future he was prepared to lose defending a client whose own recklessness had already very nearly cost them both everything. Julian, however, was long past the point where uncertainty could reach him at all. The brandy, and the fear, and 11 months of careful plotting unraveling within a single terrible afternoon, had burned through whatever caution had once restrained him. "You will hand over whatever you have taken from my study," he said, his voice low and rough and shaking now. "Or I promise you, Margaret, you will not see this child raised at all." "You would not dare," Margaret said, though her voice shook now despite every effort to steady it. "There are people who know where I am this very hour. Julian. Cecilia expects a note from me by evening. If it does not come, she has already been told exactly what to do, and exactly whom to summon." "Then we had better make certain," Julian said, low and rough, "that the note is written to her satisfaction, and that nothing in it needs to alarm anyone at all." Margaret drew a slow breath, willing her voice to remain even, though the child within her had begun to move restlessly, as though sensing her mother's fear. "You speak of debts as though they justify what has been done to me these 11 months, Julian. They do not. A man may inherit debts from his father. He does not inherit the right to forge his wife's signature, or to raise his hand against her, or to plot with his solicitor to have her declared unfit for the crime of asking honest questions. Those were choices, Julian, made freely, one after another, and I will not stand in this room and let you call them anything else." For a moment, something almost like shame crossed his face, quickly buried beneath the older, more familiar anger. "You understand nothing of the pressures I have carried since my father died," he said. "The estate, the tenants, the name itself, all resting on my shoulders alone since I was scarcely older than you are now." "Then you should have told me," Margaret said. "I was your wife, Julian, not merely an ornament for your table or a purse to be quietly emptied. I might have helped you carry it, had you ever once trusted me enough to let me try." Voss shifted uneasily near the door, glancing once toward the window, as though calculating, for the first time, how far his own complicity might yet reach, and what it might cost him personally should this particular afternoon end badly for his client. "Your Grace," he said carefully, "perhaps a period of calm reflection, before matters proceed any further." "Be silent, Edmund," Julian snapped, not taking his eyes from Margaret. "This is no longer your concern to manage." This, Margaret thought, with a strange and terrible clarity that seemed to slow the whole room around her, is the moment I have been quietly preparing for these past 3 months, without ever fully admitting to myself that I knew it was coming. She did not hand over anything. She stepped back instead toward the window, toward the embroidered bell pull that would summon the household staff, and Julian, seeing her intention a half-second too late, reached for her wrist with the very same hand that had left a mark there 11 months before. The struggle that followed was brief, though it would feel, in Margaret's memory afterward, far longer than it truly lasted. In the seconds before it began, everything in the room seemed to slow and sharpen at once, the way Margaret had heard soldiers sometimes describe the moment before a battle. She noticed, with strange clarity, the fine dust caught in the afternoon light slanting through the study window. She noticed the small tremor in Voss's hand where it rested on the doorframe, the sound of Julian's ragged breathing, the low, insistent movement of the child within her own body, as though it too sensed the danger pressing in from every side. She thought, absurdly, of her father's face on her wedding morning, wet with proud tears, and understood in that instant how very little either of them had truly known, on that bright April day, of what this marriage would eventually demand of her. Julian's grip closed hard over her wrist, and he pulled her away from the bell pull with a strength the drink had not diminished, only sharpened into something reckless and untethered. Margaret twisted against him with everything her body would allow, one arm curling protectively over the swell of her stomach, and she called out not a scream, exactly, but a single clear word, her husband's own name, said with such sudden force that it carried through the closed sitting-room door and echoed down the corridor beyond. It was enough. The door burst open within seconds, not to admit some rescuer with a raised blade, as such stories sometimes promise their listeners, but to admit something far more effective in that particular house, at that particular hour, witnesses, and the plain, undeniable weight of what they had already come prepared to see. Mrs. Pratchett, who had watched 11 months of unexplained bruises she had never once been permitted to name aloud in her own mistress's hearing. A footman, summoned by the housekeeper the moment Julian's carriage had rolled in early and unsteady that afternoon. And behind them both, breathless from having driven her own carriage at reckless speed the moment Margaret's brief note reached her that very morning, Lady Cecilia, with her brother the Colonel close at her heels, still dressed in his travel coat, having ridden through from York the instant her letter reached him. Julian, startled badly by the sudden crowd filling the doorway, loosened his grip on Margaret's wrist just enough for her to twist free at last. He stumbled backward against the edge of his own desk, knocking a heavy brass inkstand clattering to the floor, and in his drunken effort to catch his balance, he struck his head hard against the corner of the mantelpiece and went down, dazed rather than gravely injured, blood welling thin and bright at his temple, his breathing ragged but steady. The silence that followed his fall was its own kind of verdict, more damning than any single word spoken in that room all afternoon. Sir Edmund Voss made one last attempt to salvage what remained of the situation, insisting in a voice gone suddenly less certain that the entire affair was a private domestic misunderstanding, best resolved quietly, within the family, without unnecessary scandal reaching the wider county. It was Colonel Ashford, a man of considerable standing in his own right and no patience remaining for solicitors who spoke in careful evasions, who put a final end to that particular attempt. "I have here," the Colonel said, drawing a folded set of papers from the breast of his travel coat, his voice carrying easily through the room, "sworn statements from Dr. Nathaniel Hale, regarding a documented pattern of injury consistent with repeated assault over the course of nearly a year, and a separate deposition, freely given, from a clerk of your own office, Voss, regarding certain notarizations he no longer wishes to have his name attached to before God or the law. I would think very carefully before you use the word misunderstanding again in my hearing, sir, or in the hearing of the magistrate I intend to visit before this day is through." "Colonel," Mrs. Pratchett said then, stepping forward with a steadiness that surprised even herself, her hand still faintly trembling at her sides, "I have kept a record, sir, of my own, these 11 months. Dates. What I saw and when I saw it. I did not know what use it would ever serve, only that someone, someday, ought to have the truth of this house written down plainly, in case her ladyship should ever need it and I was no longer here to say it aloud." She drew a small, worn notebook from her apron pocket, its pages soft with handling, and held it out toward the Colonel with both hands, as though relieved, finally, to set it down. The Colonel took it gently, and something in his weathered face softened as he did, the particular gratitude of a man who had come prepared for a fight and found, instead, an ally he had not expected. "Thank you, Mrs. Pratchett," Margaret said quietly, and found that her voice, for the first time that whole terrible afternoon, threatened to break entirely. "I did not know. All these months, I did not know anyone else was keeping count." "Begging your ladyship's pardon," the housekeeper said, her own composure cracking just slightly at last, now that the worst of the danger had visibly passed, "but someone always is. It only rarely feels safe enough to say so out loud." The village constable arrived some while later, summoned by the footman, and took his own careful account of the afternoon's events from each person present in turn, writing everything down in a small official book with a slowness that tested Margaret's remaining patience, though she was grateful, even then, for his evident thoroughness. Julian answered the constable's questions in a flat, defeated voice, offering no further protest, no further threats, only the exhausted compliance of a man who understood, at last, that the outcome of that particular afternoon had already been decided the moment the sitting-room door burst open. Voss said nothing further in his own defense. He simply reached, quietly and without further protest, for his hat. Julian, still on the floor, one hand pressed to the shallow cut at his temple, looked up at his wife, at Margaret, standing now with one hand braced against the desk for balance and the other curved protectively over their unborn child. Her expression not triumphant, not even angry any longer, only exhausted in a way that reached all the way to her bones, and finally, unmistakably, free. "Margaret," he said, his voice small and stripped bare in a way she had never once heard in 11 months of marriage. "Margaret, I save it for the magistrate," she said, and turned away from him for what would be the very last time in her life. Dr. Hale arrived some 20 minutes later, summoned by the footman before the struggle had even fully ended, and moved past Julian on the floor without a second glance, going directly to Margaret's side, his hand steady as ever as he checked her pulse and asked her, in a low and even voice, whether she felt any pain low in her back or any tightening across her middle, the particular signs a physician watches for after a shock so near a woman's time. Finding none, he allowed himself, for just a moment, an expression that was not merely professional concern, and Margaret found, even in the exhaustion of that terrible afternoon, that she noticed it, and was glad of it. Mrs. Pratchett set about restoring some order to the room, sending the younger footman for the magistrate's constable in the village, and Cecilia stayed close beside Margaret's chair, one hand resting lightly on her friend's shoulder, saying nothing at all, simply present in the way that mattered most in such a moment. Julian was helped, eventually, to a chair of his own, his head bandaged by Dr. Hale with the same careful professionalism he would have shown any patient, guilty or otherwise, and he said nothing further to anyone for the remainder of that long afternoon, watching instead, in silence, as the household he had ruled for 11 months quietly reorganized itself around a truth he could no longer suppress. Justice, in the end, moved more slowly than Margaret would have liked, but it moved with a certainty that surprised even her father's cautious old solicitor, a man who had spent 30 years advising wool merchants and had rarely, in all that time, seen a matter reach so plainly and completely to its proper conclusion. The forged documents, carefully matched against Margaret's true signature and Voss's own careless, telltale handwriting, gave the courts more than sufficient cause to strip Julian of any further control over her dowry, and to place the Rothmere estate under strict outside administration until its considerable debts were properly untangled and repaid. Sir Edmund Voss lost his license to practice law within the county before spring arrived, and some months later, his liberty as well, once a second and far larger fraud, entirely unrelated to Margaret's own case, came to light under the close scrutiny his first crime had invited from magistrates newly disinclined to trust him. Julian faced no formal charge of assault, for the law of that era offered little enough protection to wives in that particular regard, a fact Margaret understood with a quiet, lasting bitterness she never fully learned to set down. But the forgery charges alone were sufficient, in the end, to see him convicted before the assizes, his title suspended in all but empty name, his fortune reduced to a small fraction of what it had once been, and his reputation, the one possession he had always guarded more fiercely than his own marriage, utterly and permanently ruined across every drawing-room in Yorkshire. Sir Edmund Voss lost his license to practice law within the county before spring arrived, and some months later, his liberty as well, once a second and far larger fraud, entirely unrelated to Margaret's own case, came to light under the close scrutiny his first crime had invited from magistrates newly disinclined to trust him. The weeks between that terrible December afternoon and the assizes proved harder, in some ways, than the year that had preceded them. Margaret spent them at Colonel Ashford's coastal house, growing heavier and more tired by the day, while lawyers she had never met corresponded at length with her father's solicitor, and Julian, confined for the duration to Rothmere Hall under a magistrate's order, sent no letters and made no attempt at contact of any kind. Cecilia stayed with her through nearly every one of those weeks, and it was Cecilia who first suggested, gently, that Margaret ought to write down her own account of the marriage in full, from its bright beginning to its dark unravelling, not for any court's benefit but for her own, so that the whole long year might finally exist somewhere outside the private, exhausting confines of her own memory. Margaret filled nearly 40 pages before she was done, and found, to her surprise, that the writing of it left her lighter rather than heavier, as though she had finally set down a weight she had been carrying so long she had forgotten it could be set down at all. Margaret attended only one day of the proceedings at the assizes, seated beside her father, who had travelled up from Leeds the moment word reached him and had not left her side since. She listened as Mrs. Pratchett's careful record was read aloud into the court, dates and small observations rendered suddenly enormous in that formal room, and she listened as Dr. Hale gave his testimony in a calm, unhurried voice that never once wavered, even under the sharp questioning of Julian's newly hired counsel. She did not look at Julian directly, not once, though she was aware of him throughout, seated pale and diminished at the far end of the room, a shadow of the confident young duke who had once bowed over her hand at her father's table. When the verdict came, she felt no triumph in it, only a long, quiet exhale, the particular relief of a burden finally, officially, set down. He left the county before the following winter closed in, and Margaret never saw him again in the whole of her life. Her daughter was born 3 weeks after that terrible afternoon, in the small coastal house Colonel Ashford had offered without a moment's hesitation, with Cecilia holding one of Margaret's hands through every difficult hour, and, at Margaret's own quiet and deliberate request, Dr. Hale present in the room to see the child safely into the world. Margaret named her Grace, for the mercy she felt she had, against every early expectation, finally been granted, and for the first time in nearly a year, she slept through an entire night without once waking to listen for the sound of boots in the corridor outside her door. Nathaniel Hale did not press his suit that spring, nor the spring after it. He waited, as he had always waited through every difficult month of their acquaintance, with the same patient steadiness he had shown her from the very first night he examined her injuries without once asking her to explain or excuse them. It was Margaret, in the end, who spoke first, on an ordinary golden afternoon 18 months later, watching him kneel in the garden to help small Grace gather fallen apples into the front of her pinafore. "You have never once asked anything of me," she said, coming to stand beside him in the long grass. "In all this time we have known one another." "I did not think you owed anyone a debt of that particular kind," he answered, rising and brushing the earth from his knees. "Not after everything already asked of you by other, far less deserving hands." "Perhaps," Margaret said, watching her daughter's small determined fingers close around another fallen apple, "I would simply like to give something freely now, rather than have it taken from me again." They married the following autumn, quietly, in the small stone coastal church near Colonel Ashford's house, with Grace, not yet 2 years old, held on her mother's hip through the whole brief ceremony, reaching once, solemnly, to touch the lace at her mother's sleeve. Margaret kept her dowry, fully restored to her by the courts that spring, and used a portion of it to establish a small standing fund at the local parish, quietly available to any woman in the county who found herself in need of a private and dignified means of leaving a dangerous home. She never spoke publicly of precisely why she had founded it, and she never needed to. The women who came quietly to the parish house, and left again some weeks later with a little money and a very great deal more courage than they had carried in with them, understood well enough on their own. One such woman came to the parish house in the fund's second year, a tenant farmer's wife from a neighboring estate, her arm set in a splint and her eyes carrying the particular wariness Margaret recognized at once, having worn that same expression herself for the better part of a year. Margaret sat with her for the better part of an afternoon, saying very little, only listening, and when the woman finally asked, in a small and disbelieving voice, why a duchess should trouble herself over a farmer's wife's private troubles, Margaret told her, simply, that she had once needed exactly this kind of afternoon herself, and had been fortunate enough to have friends who gave it to her freely. The woman left 3 weeks later for a cousin's household 2 counties away, and wrote to Margaret every Christmas thereafter, a small, ordinary correspondence that Margaret treasured rather more than the return of her own restored fortune, because it proved, each year, that the quiet work she and Cecilia had built together was still doing precisely what they had built it to do. Mrs. Pratchett, too old by then for the demanding work of a great house, came to live in a small cottage near Margaret's own new home, and visited often enough that Grace grew up calling her, without any prompting, by the name a grandmother might have earned. Old Simmons wrote once a year at Christmas, faithfully, from a smaller household 2 counties over, and Margaret always wrote back at length, thanking him again, as she had never quite managed to do properly at the time, for the small kindness of a cup of tea left waiting in a dark pantry through a year that had otherwise offered her so very little warmth. Colonel Ashford stood godfather to Grace, and later to the 2 younger children Margaret and Nathaniel raised together in the years that followed, and he liked to say, at every family gathering thereafter, that he had never in all his years of military service felt prouder of a single afternoon's work than the one that had ended with Julian Rothmere face down upon his own study floor. Cecilia, for her part, never remarried, though she was never short of admirers. She said, when Margaret once asked her gently why, that she had found a great deal more purpose in helping other frightened women find their own doors than she had ever found in searching for a second husband of her own, and Margaret, who understood better than most exactly what that purpose had cost and given her friend in equal measure, never asked again. Margaret often told her daughter, once Grace was old enough to understand it properly, that a grand title and a fine house had once very nearly cost her everything she had, and that no ring, however costly its stones, was ever worth more than a woman's own safety and her own peace of mind. It was not a lesson she delivered as a lecture, standing over the girl with a raised finger. It was simply the plain truth of her own life, offered gently and without embellishment, in much the same quiet way Dr. Hale had once offered her the plain truth of her own injuries, all those years before, without flinching, and without ever once pretending not to see. On quiet evenings, long after Grace and her younger brothers had been put to bed, Margaret sometimes sat with Nathaniel in the small garden behind their coastal home, listening to the sea beyond the low stone wall, and found herself marveling, still, at the plain and ordinary happiness of an evening that asked nothing frightening of her at all. No listening for boots in a corridor, no careful rehearsal of enthusiastic replies, no candle shielded behind a folded screen. She had spent a full year of her life believing that safety was a thing other women were simply born fortunate enough to keep, and it had taken her a great deal of courage, and a great many people willing to stand beside her, to learn that safety was instead a thing a woman might have to build for herself, piece by careful piece, out of whatever honest materials came to hand. She had built it. She meant, for the whole remainder of her life, to keep it. If this story keeps you hooked, subscribe so you never miss the next one, and comment below telling me where you're watching from. I would truly love to say hello and find out just how far our story has traveled.